Hey folks, welcome back. So it's funny, I was checking over my iPhone and looking at all my previous notes, and I found a gem that I created so long ago. And I thought it'd be awesome for me to make a video and show you these notes that I took back in 2018, which is crazy, and to really talk about what they mean. And I want to describe them for you today. So this is a great knowledge dump for you in terms of IAM, things that if you're a contractor, even anybody in just IAM in general, these are things that we think about in the IAM world. So I want to show this to you, and let's talk more about each one. It's going to be a little bit ad hoc, so you're going to walk through everything with me, and we're going to talk through it. It's going to be kind of long, so I'll make sure to have chapters for you so you can skip around if there's some topics that make more sense to you. So let's go ahead and get started. So on my screen here, you'll see is the different notes I took here. And I want to talk about each one and really explain what they mean to you. So let's talk about the first one. So use cases defined. When you're in IAM, when you think about implementation, let's talk about that first. If you're on a implementation team, let's say you're going in and you're helping a company spin up Okta or SailPoint IDIQ, your first questions you should ask, and this could be you, yourself as an analyst, maybe you're a business analyst or a BA, maybe you're a combination of both, maybe even you're an engineer. Architects do this too. What are your use cases? What are you trying to solve? What are the goals you have? Use cases could be, hey, how we do joiner, how we do mover, how we do lever, those use cases. If you're somebody who works for the government or in that federal space, how do we authenticate using PIV cards, for example? Or can we go passwordless? These are the use cases you need to define yourself. So when you see these or when you're on projects yourself, these are the first questions you should think about is what are we trying to solve? What is our use cases? Because all your requirements, everything you're trying to solve and do yourself, these are use cases. And if you're somebody who uses like Agile, for example, they're user stories that you create and you break everything down and you take them by sprints. So that's about user stories and how really effective it is in the IAM world. The second part is user bases, because they're all different. And you'll see here on my screen, I have employees, contractors, privileged users, detail leads. These are some of the different user bases you need to think about, because remember, not all people in companies are equal. Because here's a good example. So as a federal contractor, for example, you have people who are employees, but then you have contractors. A lot of times our access is different. There are some things that we can do as a contractor that we can't do as an employee, or vice versa. If you're a government employee yourself, you maybe have access to other things, or you make the decisions. So that means your accesses could be different. Even privileged users. Of course, if you're a regular user, so you get access to your normal things, Outlook, email, maybe some SaaS applications. That's great. But what if you're a privileged user? For example, what if you're a global administrator on Entra or in Okta? You're a super admin. You're the admin. You run Okta. You're a privileged user. How do that work? How does that work today for you? Are there certain requirements? Do you want it to where you can maybe just-in-time provision or JIT or PIM if you're an Entra person and get access for maybe 3 to 4 hours? Maybe we want to do least privilege. And even if you're a privileged user, how does that work? Can I only be a global administrator for 3 hours and I have to put justification for that? That's really what that means. Now, detailees is something more in the federal space, where you have people who are maybe in a different organization or a different agency and they come support you temporarily. How does that work for that user? Again, not all users are the same. So a detailee is somebody different. So they might keep their email from their agency that they went to or they work for. Let's say, for example, DHS, but they're coming over to help maybe some way HHS, for example, but they're keeping their emails. But how do they get access to my applications? And these are the things in IAM where you need to solve or even think about is how do we do that? Do they follow the same structure as a new user? Do we put them in the joiner process, or are they different? And there's so many use cases out there where you have to be very unique in how that works. A good example is this. There was projects that I've been on where detailees were created manually. And it doesn't follow our process, but we have that documented. And we made sure from a security perspective, they were reviewed every month. and just make sure that they have access. And we were always in contact with their manager or the project they're supporting on to make sure that they were doing their job. And then when was their tenure over? Sometimes they become actual employees. How's that roll over? So detailees can be very, very unique in that situation because they are not technically your employee, or they're not actually physically tied to that organization or the agency that you work for, but they're here to support you temporarily. So they need access to certain things to do their job to help your organization or agency, but they're treated differently. Foreign service nationals is, again, another conversation when it comes to if you're a federal contractor or you work for a federal agency. These are people who are not from the United States. They're here as a foreign national to support us or something like that. How do you handle them? They're very similar to detailees, and they can be handled the same way or differently. And in the federal space, there are specific documentation on how we handle foreign service nationals. And that is, from an identity perspective, how you need to be very careful, because if you work for an agency who has high-level security information and data, you might not give foreign service nationals that access today because they're not vetted or their background check isn't really fully to the level that it should be. So as an identity person, you need to think about that and look at all your processes and your structure, and even work with HR and your security team to make sure that foreign service nationals who come to your organization to do something, what access do you give to them and what rules do you have applying to them? Partner agencies are the same thing I talked about there. How do you have a trust relationship? Do you have a federation between the two that you work from there? In the old school way, even someday today, federal government, they have it where you have a forest trust between the two agencies in AD, where now if you go to the cloud, you can do federation between the two agencies there and have partners where they come in as an external user. They have something in Entra, for example, called cross-tenant sync, or MTO, multi-tenant organizations, where you can have it where you have partners talk to each other and they're treated similar the same way, except they're labeled as an external user in Entra, for example. Citizens are, again, if it's like a volunteer that you have working for you, how's that handled? Sometimes they're seasonal, so how does that work from there? Do you offer them differently? Sometimes, for example, for citizens or volunteers, for example, maybe they only work part-time, but you have these policies that say, hey, if you leave the organization, I retain you for maybe 3 months, and then we nuke your account. Maybe there's some certain rules for those people where you know that they're only working, let's say, the summer, and then they're off for the fall, winter, and spring, come back in the summer again. That's a lot of months. Do you keep them differently and put them in different rules? And so as an IAM practitioner, that's something you have to think about too. And you work with your team to validate that with your customer to make sure that, hey, do we have specific rules for volunteers, and make sure we document that and we run through the process. Service accounts is a huge topic today. And the big topic is, a lot of times service accounts, people call them as non-human accounts, right? And that is a very big subject that's really flying around in LinkedIn today. How do you manage them? Because they're a necessity for a lot of things. So for example, if you have a service account that has to do something in the back end for you, let's say you do a skim process or some kind of work that you need to have interactions or some API conversation between two systems, service accounts need to do that job because you don't want to do it manually. That's an awful, position that you have to do. But how do you manage that from a security perspective? How do you make sure that it follows some security protocol, and especially in the IAM world? It's difficult from there. And you have so much documentation, or even people with very specific ideals of how service accounts should be managed. You have various things. For example, Entra has managed identities that you can use there, or service principals you can use there, that when your resource or your application is deleted, that service account is deleted too. And there's some things too with service accounts where you want to make sure you document them properly and have maybe some naming convention. These are, again, nuggets, the things that you think about in the IAM world as an analyst, developer, and engineer, even architect, is, do we have naming structures for them? Is there a certain review process we need to do? Again, in some of the old videos I talked about, I worked for a commercial company where I came in and I was reviewing all these service accounts who had awful names. And I had no idea what they meant. So I just started to turn them off slowly, so it happens. And I took down a server, I took down a website for a couple of minutes. That could have cost my company millions of dollars true statement because it was a big website that had a lot of traffic for users, but it was poorly documented. So that's how service accounts need to be really think about in the IAM world is how do you manage them? You need to know a good naming convention. You need to know how are they accessed today? Should there be a rotation of tokens, for example, of their APIs? Or even a certain other things when it comes to service accounts that you need to really take into account because they're very, very, they can be a huge headache for you in the IAM world, and they can be a source of where if a breach occurs, service accounts is the first place that could be looked upon because I can't tell you how many stories I've seen where some service account has a very crappy password, people figure it out, and they get access to everything. I believe recently there was a one for McDonald's that had a chatbot, right? And the chatbot had a very stupid password 123 or something very, very simple and generic. And a pen testing company got in and showed to them, and they got access to over 24 million chatbot applications. Not good. So service accounts is very, very important. And then temporary accounts. So temporary accounts, again, I talked about that earlier. Temporary accounts is accounts where maybe they're a DTLE. Maybe there's somebody who's only here for a week. How do you manage them today? And they're not as easy as you think they are. So those are the user bases that you talked about in the notes that I wrote down when I got really, really into IAM, that I wanted to really learn myself and just find this, which is so much fun. So let's talk more about this. Are user basic models and attributes identified for each? So when it comes to the users up top here, so we talked about these user bases here, and number 3, are there attributes that you can use? Or do you need to have them created? Or do they need to be transformed? That happens a lot. All of them, because there's sometimes where there are gaps. You don't have attributes. You need to recreate them. And somewhere they're not the most prettiest. The biggest thing about IAM is user data and how important it is to have pristine data. Because garbage in is garbage out. So number 3 is very, very important from there is you want to make sure that your attributes for your all user models are pristine and they're good to go. If not, you need to talk with HR or work with them to alleviate this problem. Because again, if you do not do this and you're some organization that maybe uses ABAC, attribute-based access control to do all the vetting, what happens when the data is wrong and someone gets more access than they should have been? It's a problem. And you violate least privilege. Are onboarding, offboarding, and change features identified for each? That's your simple joiner, mover, leaver. How are they defined today? How are they different today? And going back to our original, is if you're a company coming in to implement, let's say, SailPoint, how does the company want to do that going forward with SailPoint? Those are the different procedures you need to identify as an IAM analyst, identity, whatever person, and then document them. You'll hear me a lot in this conversation with you of documentation, how important it is. This is very huge too. Establish a global unique identifier. You want identities to have someone where you can usually distinguish between each other. Because you'll have people with the same last names. You have so many John Smiths or Mike Johnsons or whatever. These Dwayne Johnson, any one of these people, right? They have common names. How do you separate them? A lot of times your HR systems will give somebody a unique employee ID, for example, and that is only tied to that one person. So as an identity person, when you come in or when you start to deploy new systems for organizations, one of the first things, again, is look at, hey, does your Workday or does your UltraPro, any one of those systems, do they have a mechanism to have a globally unique identifier? Because if you don't, you have a problem. In Entra, for example, your UPN is your unique identifier because that should never change, or it's immutable at times where only certain things can make it change, but it's very static or to the point. And again, most companies today, some employee ID is very, very common when it comes to organizations and have a unique identifier. But you'd be surprised how many companies don't have that. It's a true statement too, because I've seen that in my career. Number 6, major department and roles need to be managed. So this is a combination of RBAC and the common pitfalls of RBAC, role explosion, but also when you have a mover situation where you have people who move up and down when it comes to the organization chart. How are your departments or your roles managed from there? Because if you have departments that change often their names, it's a nightmare when it comes to using that as your mover mechanism or trigger. And that's common. You'd be, again, surprised how many companies, their departments change often. And that's somewhere where you can't use that. So maybe use something else. And that's interesting for roles. When it comes to management, who manages the roles? Please tell me it's not a spreadsheet. But again, you'd be surprised how many times I've been on organizations where I come in and I'm like, you have it on a spreadsheet? Really? Wow. Thank God I'm here. That's true. So you need to make sure how are your departments and roles managed, because that is a huge trigger when it comes to mover process or anything in terms of maybe RBAC, for example, and giving people access. Because a lot of times when you do, let's say, role mining from a top-down analysis perspective, where you're looking at roles and how people fit in those roles, if the department of each role, the cost center changes, it could be a problem and you don't want to use that. So that's where number 6 comes into play. So SharePoint and file shares, this is more permission based. So a lot of times you have organizations that have SharePoint access. How do you manage those from there? And what access can you do? And how are those managed today? So for example, in Entra or in that realm, SharePoint Online, that's more easier, right? You have RBAC roles that you can manage from there, and you have M365 groups that you can really manage access from a SharePoint perspective from there. But other places, organizations that don't have it, more trickier. So that's something you want to think about. Exception handling is errors. How do you handle errors? If you, let's say, have a joiner process and it breaks, what happens? Are you giving, or some user wants to, let's say, have access to something and it doesn't work? Is there a nice way to give a error message, or is it some random blue screen and random numbers that they have no idea what they're doing? Exception handling is something you want to make sure, and as an identity person, even with a developer, you bake in or you make it somewhere where it's more friendly when it comes to that. Or if something breaks, it routes to a proper log that you can look at, and that's something that you can verify. Even audit logs when it comes to exception handling, because that will be beneficial to you to see what the problem is so you can fix it. Where are we at? So missing owners, this comes to you have approvals. When you have people who need to approve, let's say, access requests, what if you have something that's missing? And there are tons of times where you have system owners that aren't present, or even access reviews. How do you manage that? Do you have a delegation process that maybe goes one up that needs to happen, and notifications that need to come out from there? Escalation, same thing. What if something happens? Do you have an escalation process? Is it like after 10 days, it goes up to somebody else? After 5 days, do you email the manager's manager after 5 days or for an approval process or some shape or form? That's escalations. And how do you handle that? Because in an identity world, you got to build that in, and that needs to be baked in. I talked a little bit about that on number 9, approval roles, system owners. Who are the approvers? Is it manager-led, system owner-led? Who are the decision makers? You need to identify those people. 12 is very important. Separation of duties. So you cannot be, I've said this many times in my videos, you can't be a check issuer and a check cashier at the same time, or you can't be accounts payable and accounts receivable. That doesn't work. That's a separation of duty violation. There are times where overrides could happen. I've never seen it in my career, but I wrote it down because I've heard it talked about before. How do you handle that process today? How's it documented? And how are people notified when overrides happen? Risk models for users, how risky? So obviously your end user might be not as risky, but your privileged users are very risky. TTLEs can be very risky too. Foreign served nationals can be very risky. How do you manage risk? How do you classify that risk? And what rules need to be in play for each one of these types of users in terms of how risky they are? And that could be something such as more frequent access reviews, and maybe more monitoring of their access and what they're doing things from an audit perspective. Birthright requirements. So, but these are birthright roles. A lot of times it's if you are on board to a new company, what access do you have off the bat? So for example, if you're a company that says, hey, everybody gets Slack, everybody gets Outlook, everybody gets access to all the Office products, and everybody gets access to the time management system. Perfect. Those are birthright roles. Where you can be somebody who, when you get onboarded and you work for the Power Apps team, maybe you have to request Power Apps because I don't know they work Power Apps from there. And that's more of a requestable access versus birthright roles where everybody across the board gets it on day one. Access reviews and approvals, we talked about that already. I'm not going to go over that again. Sources of truth. what is your data coming from? Where's it coming from? Is that the source of truth? I worked for a commercial company where my source of truth was 3 different places, and I was, what was the right word for me? I was stunned when I saw that. 3 different places, which is unheard of, but it happens. And that's something where you need to think about where it comes to source of truth is who wins. Because for this organization that I supported, they had chunks of user data from each one of the systems that made one user overall. And if one thing failed, you have missing data. What happens? And that's where source of truth you need to, as an identity person, really need to understand and think about is what are your source of truth? Is it one which makes life easier? Or in my case, where I had fun, it was 3 different places. And document that again and understand what the data is coming from for each source of truth. And you need to identify what they are. So a lot of times it's asking questions and make sure, hey, where does that come from? And is there somewhere else that overrides it? Or is this the legitimate source of truth that I should know about? Because when you integrate into a system and you're pulling data in, let's say, again, HR system to SailPoint, you got to make sure that that's the only place to pull in from. Everything else is not necessary, or you don't put value in that data. All right, where we're at now. Let's see. What systems need to be integrated? So we'll use SailPoint as an example today. When I'm onboarded and I have my users created, what systems am I integrating with SailPoint? What am I pushing data to? AD, cool. What about, am I pushing to Salesforce? Am I pushing to maybe some mainframe system? Or in Okta, for example, are there SaaS applications I need to integrate to? Or does Okta need to integrate with AD? Or is maybe an LDAP server? Those are the integrations that you talk about, or you ask about when it comes to, in the IAM world, what systems are we implementing? And a lot of times when you do that, it's, hey, I have a core system in identity. What other systems am I talking to? Or am I pushing data into them? Or am I pulling data into? So from a SailPoint perspective, migration could be in the HR system to pull data in, and I'm taking that data and I'm pushing it to other systems. And that's what integrations is when you think about. Reporting requirements is very important. When it comes to reporting is, are you setting a daily record of maybe people who are offboarded? This is huge too. I've been a part of these where whenever we do terminations every Friday. So there's a report that's sent out to all managers for their awareness of people who have been terminated. And then when it comes to frequency is, when do we do it? And reports not just terminations. It could be access reviews, for example, right? Reporting is very important, especially when it comes to, when you talk to the higher ups and they ask questions about like, how's your identity system working? How's the project going? And remember, folks, IAM it's an ongoing process. It's an ongoing project. It's never like, hey, we're done, right? It's always evolving. So keep that in mind. If you work for a company that says, hey, IAM is just a project, run. It's not. It's an ongoing, basically ongoing initiative from start to finish, always, till the company is no longer in business. Certifications, that's your access reviews. When do you want to do it? Annually, bi-monthly, well, not bi-monthly, annually, twice a year, quarterly, once every month. Those are conversations you need to have with the company. I personally prefer quarterly because a lot of times companies do it annually and they always do it at the end of the year in December. That's Christmas time. That's holiday season. For people in the United States, that's holiday season. People are off, sometimes for the whole month. Not gonna work. So I always tell people, I always suggest to organizations do it quarterly. You have chunks and you know exactly who you did. So when it comes back time, let's say springtime, you did something in spring, you do it again in spring. That's kind of annually, right? You've already done that, right? Or it's easier for you because you're not just rubber stamping. You're actually taking the time to really understand the requirements, or I'm sorry, not requirements. You're understanding the access that people are getting, and you're taking the time to really read them and say, okay, yes, John does need this, this, and this. Oh, wait, he doesn't need this anymore. He got promoted. We know that, and we remove the access automatically. And frequency. If it's annually, fine. You know, that's kind of how it works, but maybe you ask them to maybe do it earlier, or again, back to the early about delegation. Is there somebody else who could also do this? So if, let's say, John is out for vacation in December, you have Sally comes in and she can do it all. That's how it works. Federal reporting. So this is, when I did this list, I was actually a federal contractor, but federal reporting requirements. So there are certain initiatives, and if you're somebody who is in the federal space, you'll hear of CDM, the Continuous Diagnostic Mitigation Program, where you have federal requirements to report up to a federal dashboard. These are the question tabs, or if you're doing something in terms of like FIPS, or you're doing like an ATO, for example, you have to report things. right? You got to report all your findings. You got to report that what are your requirements. As a federal contractor, this is where it's important to ask those questions, because you're reporting, maybe you have to bake one in to push that up to some place, maybe on a monthly basis. Whereas in the commercial world, you don't have to worry about this. This is something that is always not talked about, or to me, it's identity, is physical systems. When you go to work, how do you get into the office? I know now there's back to return to office for there, or partial or hybrid, or that, for example. How do you get to the office? Do you badge in? Do you fingerprint in? Is that face in? How do you get into the building? Is you just walk right in? It's the door right in, right? Identity is important from there, because a lot of times for me, I ask that question. Hey, how is IAM? How is our sell points integrated with maybe some access tool? Because if I am terminated, my badge should be disabled ASAP. And there's so many times where that does not happen. And it's common. So a lot of times you need to ask that question is, hey, how is our physical security system working today? And is it integrated with maybe our AD or maybe with SailPoint? If it's not, we should talk about that. How's that system be updated commonly? Is there an update from there? How do you have access to the physical system? These questions as an identity person, you need to know. Because honestly, a lot of times I've seen it, it's just username and password. And they're simple username and passwords. Not good. So a lot of the times when you hear identity, they don't talk about this a lot. But it's very important that how is your physical system security tied into IAM? If it's not, it should be. PIV requirements, this is again in a federal space, is do you have specific PIV requirements? Is it X509 requirements? Is there a certain specific certification or certs that you need to put on them that need to be updated? How are certs updated? Like how common or how many times are the certs updated? Because they do expire. Those are questions you need to ask you, because again, a lot of people who log into their laptops to use PIV cards, or even log into a building, for example, in the identity world, that's a key part, because if somebody's system or their cert is expired, they need to update it, they don't have access to anything, it's a problem. So do you have a fail-safe for that? Is there a way for you to maybe have them log in with username and password, or a temporary way to get access to a building? That actually is really part of identity, where people don't really talk about that. So remember that. Derived credentials is something that is very different, because you have a PIV card, but then you have people with phones, right? So for example, here's my iPhone. And a lot of times in the federal space, you have what we call a government furnished equipment, or a GFE for short. They'll issue you an iPad, an iPhone, whatever. Especially for a phone, you want to access it for their sensitive data on it, but these require a PIV card to log into. That's where derived credentials come in. You're taking those credentials and you're deriving to some else or some system to take those certifications that you have on your PIV card and access something like on your mobile phone, where you can't physically take your PIV card and just go, I can't come in. That doesn't work, right? Because it doesn't work. So the derived credentials is a way for you to really take advantage of taking the cert or the certification or the actual cert within your PIV card and put it into a system, and you log in from there, and it validates you are who you are. Has data quality analysis been complete? Garbage in, garbage out. Your job in the IAM world, especially from joiner, is to make sure your data is pristine. If not, how can you work with the HR team to make that work? Because if you are somebody who's, again, using your attributes as you should to provide access, ABAC, RBAC, PBAC, any of those acts you have there too for your authorization models, your data quality is important to that. So you need to make sure that that is complete, that you do the right work to analyze, make sure it works, because if not, you have problems. That is very, very key. Just keep that in mind. User experience. So when I first started in IAM, I didn't care about user experience. I'm like, I don't care. I'm a strict security person. Too bad. Sorry. Now that's totally shifted, right? You want your users to be you want their experience to be very easy. You don't want to be hard at all, right? You want to make it very simple for them, but you want to also make it secure. Because if it's not, it's a problem. So you need to really talk with your teams, talk about user experience. Hey, if I make this change in the identity space, how does it impact my users today? Am I going to make them use a password that's 18 characters long, which you should, but should I make it a phrase versus crazy numbers, right? Because if not, you're going to have people who put a sticky on their laptop or a sticky under their keyboard, and it's a vulnerability. So you want to make sure that it's secure enough, but still something where your users are not hassled when it comes to logging in or anything in terms of access today. You want to try to keep it simple, but still keep it secure. So a lot of times we talk about passwordless, right? So how do I make it easy? Windows Hello for Business, Touch ID on your Macs. Maybe you can use a YubiKey. That's maybe easier for them rather than typing in a password from there. Or maybe you don't do not MFA. You don't push notification all the time, right? That user experience from there. You're still secure, but you're not overly taxing your end users because they will find ways to get around it, and that's a vulnerability. Help desk tier 1, 2, and 3. So when you at Identity World, you talk to them. It's more like, hey, what do I want to give to my service desk people for them to do the work, right? So I've worked for companies where I actually give them Okta access from a help desk perspective, and they go in and when they get a ticket in, they'll provide access from there, and I let them put them into groups. But that's it. And there's some places who are very hands-off when it comes to that. You want to talk to your help desk lead and talk about how do we want to integrate together, because honestly, some of the best IAM people come from help desks because they do a lot of user interaction and password resets and access requests from there. So you want to make sure that you have a collective understanding of the collaboration between the two teams. Because if you're, let's say, at tier 1, you can do password resets, no problem. But if you're tier 2 and 3, where it's more in the weeds or access requests, maybe that's where you get more involved yourself, or you provide them a processes to help them do it, and then you put in checks and balances to make sure that they can only do certain things. Say give access to certain people for certain applications, but then anything higher level or more high sensitive applications, or maybe that more costs money or very limited licenses, you do that, right, as an identity person. Single sign-on, federation services, how do you want to handle that? Obviously, single sign-on is more ideal. Federation is still there, ADFS, if that's what you want to do, which is AD federated services. You have now, you can use other things, OIDC, right, in terms of access from there, which is more secure than single sign-on because you use a SAML, but questions you're asking, right? And lastly, integration. Did I put that twice? Integration is the same thing as so I talked about that there, so I don't want to like hash that more. So let's see, do I have any more? Is that it? Oh, that is it. Perfect. So there you go, folks. That's just a brain dump of just various things. I'm just talking just in general about the things that I wrote back in 2018 that I'm more experienced now. I want to talk back to you. And these are things that I deal with today on a day-to-day basis. On these questions today, I get these a lot. I solve them. I figure it out. Then we process it, we talk about it, we document it, and we move on. So if you're new to IAM or you want to get started in IAM, things that you should think about and things that in your own world, your own company, how do they do things today? And as you learn more IAM, how would you do things differently from there? Really hope this helped you in terms of just a brain dump of the things that I wrote way back in 2018. Things that help you think about, and just spark plug from you, like, oh man, cool, I want to do that too. And again, just keep posted. I'm gonna actually put a mailing list in the future to talk about my course that's coming out real soon. I'm making some refinements for everybody because I want to make sure it works properly, because I want this experience for the course to be awesome for you guys. That's all I got for everybody. Thank you so much for spending time with me, and I really hope to see you soon. Have a good one. See ya.